Under the warm evening skies of Dar es Salaam, something long suppressed has begun to rise. The air that once carried the rhythm of peace now trembles with chants, with anger, with hope. For decades, Tanzania was known as East Africa's calm and disciplined nation, a land of unity, a model of restraint. But tonight that calm has cracked. Young people are flooding the streets, holding handwritten signs, their voices echoing through the capital, "We are not afraid." It started with one decision: the government's move to block opposition figure John Hche from traveling to neighboring Kenya for the burial of Raila Odinga, a respected statesman of the region. What should have been a quiet act of mourning has become the spark for a storm. Citizens now ask, what kind of threat does a funeral pose to national security? For many Tanzanians, this was the moment the mask fell. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, once celebrated as a symbol of female leadership and post-Magufuli reconciliation, now faces growing accusations of authoritarianism. The arrest of opposition leader Tundu Lissu in April 2025 already sent shockwaves through the nation. But the silencing of his ally has turned whispers of discontent into a nationwide roar. From the universities of Dar es Salaam to the dusty border towns near Kenya, Tanzanians are rising. They are not carrying guns, only smartphones and conviction. They are live streaming, organizing, and telling the world, if they silence one of us, they silence us all. Has Tanzania, once the pride of East Africa, reached a point where dissent is a crime? Or is this the painful birth of a new democratic awakening? If you believe that freedom in Africa must never depend on permission, then stay with us. Like, share, and subscribe, because what's unfolding in Tanzania may reshape the political soul of an entire continent. For years, Tanzania stood as East Africa's quiet success story, steady, disciplined, and seemingly immune to the political storms that shook its neighbors. But beneath that surface, calm frustration had been building like pressure under a sealed volcano. The government's promises of reform after the late President John Pombe Magufuli's death began to ring hollow. And when his successor, President Samia Suluhu Hassan, took office as the nation's first female leader, many believed a gentler, more democratic era was about to begin. At first, her tone was one of reconciliation. She spoke softly, wore a motherly smile, and promised a Tanzania where no voice will be silenced. But by 2025, those words had lost their meaning. Civil society groups reported increased surveillance, new restrictions on assembly, and the quiet reactivation of security laws from the Magufuli era. Journalists began disappearing from newsrooms, activists whispered of arrests at night, and the youth, once inspired, began to turn restless. The spark came in April 2025 when Tundu Lissu, the country's most prominent opposition figure, was arrested under accusations of treason. For millions of Tanzanians, this was not just another political dispute, it was the death of hope. Lissu was more than a politician. He was a survivor of an assassination attempt, a voice of resilience who had returned from exile with dreams of a freer Tanzania. His arrest, many believed, was fabricated, a convenient excuse to remove the last credible challenger to the ruling establishment. Then came October 2025, when John Hche, one of Lissu's closest allies, tried to travel to Kenya to represent him at the funeral of former Prime Minister Raila Odinga. It should have been a moment of regional unity, a simple gesture of respect. Instead, Tanzanian authorities stopped Hche at the Sarari-Isebania border, claiming he posed a security risk. That single act shattered the illusion of normalcy. Within hours, the story spread across social media. Hashtags like March Free Lissu and March Let John Go exploded across Tanzanian and Kenyan platforms. Youth from both countries began posting videos of themselves chanting, "Justice knows no borders." At Dar es Salaam University, hundreds of students gathered at night holding candles, reciting the national anthem in silence, a powerful symbol of resistance. The police response was swift and harsh. Riot control units flooded the streets. Tear gas filled the air in Dar es Salaam, Arusha, and Mwanza. Dozens were detained. Government officials called the protests foreign-inspired, a phrase Tanzanians have come to recognize as code for suppression without accountability. Still, the youth refused to back down. From small rural towns to bustling urban centers, communities began organizing their own peaceful marches. Churches and mosques opened their doors to shelter protesters fleeing arrests. Even older citizens who once viewed protests as reckless started to speak out. One retired teacher told a local paper, "We taught them to believe in democracy. Now they're reminding us what it means." As the days passed, solidarity grew beyond Tanzania's borders. Kenyan activists, human rights lawyers, and even boda riders rode to the frontier in support. The Sarari Isebania crossing, once a quiet trade route, turned into a sea of flags, chants, and defiance. Videos showed young people standing shoulder to shoulder, separated by an invisible border but united by a single demand: freedom. The government, meanwhile, doubled down. Statements from Dar es Salaam warned citizens not to undermine national unity. But every warning only fueled more anger. To many, the message was clear. Tanzania was slipping into the same pattern that has haunted so many African nations: the slow death of dissent disguised as the protection of order. In just a few weeks, the nation's political temperature had risen from unease to open confrontation. And as each protest banner rose into the humid air, it carried not only the names of Lissu and Hche, but the voice of a generation no longer willing to wait for permission to be free. The spark had been lit. But no one, not even the protesters themselves, expected how fast the fire would spread. What began as anger over one man's travel ban transformed into a national reckoning echoing far beyond Tanzania's borders. At the heart of the storm was the Sarari Isebania border, the narrow crossing that divides Kenya and Tanzania. For years, it had been a symbol of quiet cooperation between two nations. Now it was the front line of defiance. Hundreds of young people from both sides converged there: students, boda riders, small traders, and unemployed graduates carrying banners that read, "Borders cannot divide freedom." Videos from the scene captured a rare sight: Kenyan and Tanzanian youths singing the same songs, waving each other's flags, chanting the names Tundu Lissu and John Hche as if they were rallying cries of a shared struggle. The chants grew louder when the first tear gas canisters were fired. Smoke rose into the twilight sky. What had started as peaceful solidarity was now a standoff between hope and fear. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, once praised internationally as a calm reformer, took to national television to address the chaos. Her tone was firm, colder than many had ever heard before. No foreign influence will dictate Tanzania's destiny, she declared. It was meant to project control. Instead, it deepened suspicion. Many heard it as a justification for repression, not reassurance. Reports began emerging that several international human rights lawyers and election observers who had entered Tanzania earlier in the month were detained and deported without explanation. The government insisted these measures were to prevent interference, but to many Tanzanians, it felt like the country was closing in on itself. By the end of the week, Dar es Salaam was under heavy surveillance. Internet speeds slowed to a crawl. Journalists reported their phone lines being tapped. The familiar tactic of digital blackout once seen in Uganda and Sudan had arrived in Tanzania. Still, the youth refused to disappear into silence. Across university campuses, in small coffee stalls, and through encrypted WhatsApp groups, they began to reorganize. A new slogan spread: "We are the children of freedom fighters." In Arusha, a young poet named Nadia Mlekwa read her verses live on Instagram before her account was shut down. "We were born in peace, but not in fear. We were promised freedom, not permission. We are the generation they cannot erase." The poem went viral before authorities could block it. Within hours, thousands of young Tanzanians reposted it using the hashtag #JohnWe'reNotAfraid. Meanwhile, tension reached parliament. A few brave members of the ruling CCM party dared to question the president's methods. One of them, speaking anonymously to the press, admitted, "We are losing the trust of our people. The youth no longer believe us." Outside protests swelled again. Clergy members and teachers joined marches urging peace but demanding accountability. Some police officers, off-duty and quietly sympathetic, refused to use force against demonstrators in their own neighborhoods. The turning point came when footage emerged of a teenage boy unarmed standing before a line of riot police holding only the Tanzanian flag. The crowd behind him fell silent. The officers hesitated. For a moment, the entire nation seemed to hold its breath. Then, instead of dispersing, the protesters began singing the national anthem softly at first, then louder, until the echoes reached the buildings around them. It was no longer just a protest. It was a declaration. In living rooms across Tanzania, people watched in silence. Many older citizens wept not out of fear but pride. For the first time in years, they saw a generation unafraid to demand dignity. But as the world began to notice, the government's patience thinned. Rumors circulated of mass arrests being planned. Security checkpoints appeared on major highways. State television broadcast warnings against foreign-funded agitation. Tanzania stood at a crossroads between the legacy of obedience and the birth of resistance. And as the chants of young protesters rose through the humid night, one truth became clear. This was no longer about John Hche or Tundu Lissu. It was about who would own the future of Tanzania, the state, or its people. When the tear gas cleared and the crowds began to thin, Tanzania found itself staring at an unfamiliar reflection. The country once celebrated as East Africa's model of calm had become the region's cautionary tale. The protests may have quieted in the streets, but something irreversible had already happened inside people's hearts. The trust between the governed and their government had been broken. Across the nation, fear and courage coexisted uneasily. In Dar es Salaam, checkpoints dotted main roads. Police trucks patrolled near universities at night, their headlights sweeping over empty sidewalks where students once marched. Local newspapers under pressure printed stories about foreign interference and youth manipulation. But even the most loyal readers could sense the change, the fear in journalists' voices, the silence in once vibrant editorial pages. For the country's Gen Z population, the largest in Tanzania's history, the moment marked a turning point. Many had grown up hearing their parents speak of unity and discipline, but now they saw how easily those ideals could be used to justify control. Some vowed never to vote again, calling the elections a performance without meaning. Others, however, saw the uprising as proof that their generation could no longer be ignored. They began organizing community forums, digital education groups, and underground civic meetings, determined to rebuild the idea of democracy from the ground up. The Tundu Lissu case remained a dark cloud over the nation. His imprisonment, officially described as preventive detention, drew condemnation from rights groups, but little action from the courts. Rumors swirled that he was being held in isolation. State television never mentioned his name again. Yet across Tanzania, graffiti began to appear overnight. Lissu ni sauti yetu, Lissu is our voice. For President Samia Suluhu Hassan, the crisis represented the sharpest decline in legitimacy since she took power. What began as admiration for her composure and inclusiveness had turned into growing skepticism about her motives. Members within her own party, the YCM, quietly expressed concern that the government's heavy-handed approach was alienating its youngest voters, the very people who could shape Tanzania's future stability. One former minister speaking anonymously said, "We are winning control but losing the nation." Meanwhile, the economic and social costs deepened. Investors pulled back, citing political uncertainty. Tourism, a pillar of the Tanzanian economy, saw cancellations from travelers wary of unrest. Non-governmental organizations reduced their operations after several staff members were detained for unauthorized gatherings. Even schools and churches reported declining attendance as families feared collective punishment for suspected dissent. The government's attempt to restore order through silence had the opposite effect. Every restriction, every arrest, every internet shutdown only fueled a deeper conversation about power and accountability. Tanzanians began to realize that democracy is not a gift from the state. It's a contract between people and power, and that contract was being rewritten whether the leadership liked it or not. Perhaps the most profound consequence, however, was not visible on television or in parliament. It was the quiet awakening of civic identity and understanding among citizens that freedom must be protected daily, not inherited once. As one elderly shopkeeper in Arusha put it, watching the protests on her phone, "They used to say our youth were lazy. Now I see they are the only ones still awake." By the end of 2025, Tanzania was no longer just debating laws, it was debating its soul. Would it continue down the path of fear or reclaim the spirit of accountability that once defined its independence? The answer, as more citizens were beginning to see, would not come from the palace in Dar es Salaam, but from the restless hearts of its people. As the protests swelled and the Tanzanian government tightened its grip, the world began to pay attention cautiously and with mixed motives. From Washington to Brussels, from Nairobi to Addis Ababa, diplomats and analysts watched the unfolding crisis like a mirror reflecting the deeper struggle over democracy itself. In the United States, officials at the State Department released a carefully worded statement. "We urge the government of Tanzania to uphold democratic norms, respect civil liberties, and engage in dialogue." The words sounded familiar, the same template once used for crises in Sudan, Uganda, and Ethiopia. But among American observers, the tone was shifting. Quietly, a new question circulated through think tanks and editorial boards. Has Washington lost its moral voice on democracy in Africa? In an op-ed for The Atlantic, one analyst wrote Tanzania's young protesters are not asking for foreign intervention. They are asking the world to stop applauding stability when it's built on silence. That sentiment struck a chord among older Americans who remembered their own civil rights movements. The images from Dar es Salaam students standing unarmed before riot police, a teenager holding the national flag against tear gas, stirred memories of Selma, of Birmingham, of the universal cost of dignity. Meanwhile, European capitals reacted with unease. France and Germany expressed concern but avoided confrontation, mindful of their economic interests in East Africa's growing trade networks. The European Union offered technical support for electoral transparency, but Tanzanians mocked the gesture online. They offer seminars while we fight for freedom. Closer to home, the African Union found itself torn. Some leaders saw the unrest as a domestic matter. Others privately admitted it exposed a regional pattern, governments clinging to power behind democratic facades. In Nairobi, Kenyan commentators spoke openly about the hypocrisy of African elites who condemn coups yet enable corruption. One journalist remarked on live television, if Tanzania's youth can rise peacefully, perhaps that's the real revolution Africa has been waiting for. Even international NGOs, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others face challenges gaining access to the country. Their reports, based on satellite imagery and testimonies from exiled Tanzanians, painted a grim picture of escalating repression. Yet, unlike crises in the Sahel or North Africa, Tanzania's story didn't make global headlines. The world's media consumed by Ukraine and Gaza barely glanced toward East Africa. Still, the global silence didn't mean global indifference. Across the African diaspora, from London to Atlanta, from Kingston to Toronto, communities began holding vigils for Tanzanian youth. Social media amplified their voices, linking the struggle in Dar es Salaam to broader movements for black self-determination. The message was simple: freedom denied anywhere is freedom threatened everywhere. And while Western leaders hesitated, African citizens abroad began filling the moral vacuum. Tanzanian students in the U.S. organized online forums. Pan-African activists in Ghana and South Africa released joint statements of solidarity. The digital border was breaking even as physical borders closed. For the first time in years, Africa's democratic crisis was being narrated not by foreign journalists, but by Africans themselves, articulate, angry, and unafraid. As one American scholar of African politics summarized, Tanzania is not isolated. It's part of a continental awakening, one that's forcing the world to decide whether democracy is still a principle or just a performance. And in that realization, the United States, Europe, and Africa all face the same haunting truth: the future of freedom will be written not in speeches, but in the courage of those who refuse to be silent. Under the night sky of Dar es Salaam, the chants have faded, but the message still lingers in the air like smoke after a storm. The streets that once echoed with defiance are quiet now, not because the struggle has ended, but because it has moved inward into the conscience of a nation. Tanzania stands at a crossroads between the comfort of silence and the courage of truth. The government may claim victory for restoring order, but beneath that fragile calm lies a question that no amount of censorship can bury. What is the worth of peace if it is built on fear? The events of 2025 will be remembered not just as another protest, but as the moment when Tanzania's youth, the sons and daughters of independence, declared that obedience is not patriotism. They have exposed the fault line between authority and accountability, between loyalty to power and loyalty to country. And while the arrests, shutdowns, and warnings may have slowed the marches, they cannot undo what has already awakened. Across Africa, the echoes are being heard from Dakar to Nairobi, from Lusaka to Ouagadougou. A new generation is rising that refuses to inherit the chains of its parents. They are not asking for revolution through violence, but for renewal through justice. Their tools are phones, their voices, their unity. Their enemy is not the government alone, but the system that tells them to wait, to obey, to remain small. For those watching from abroad, in Washington, London, or Paris, Tanzania is more than a local crisis. It is a test of whether democracy anywhere can survive complacency everywhere. When young people risk their freedom for truth, neutrality becomes complicity. So tonight, as Tanzania's candlelight vigils flicker across the digital horizon, the question extends beyond its borders. If the world claims to believe in freedom, will it stand with those who still fight for it? To everyone who believes that liberty is not a Western privilege, but a human right, this is your moment to listen to, speak to care. Please share this story if you believe that the courage of Tanzania's youth deserves to be seen. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because in the end, this is not just Tanzania's story. It is Africa's, and perhaps it is humanity's.